What's up guys, June here, and in this video I want to talk about a slightly different strategy for DPS rotations that you're probably not well acquainted with. These rotations are going to capitalize on the basic abilities that deal double damage against any enemy that's stunned or bound. Chances are most of you exercise your DPS rotations at bosses that are immune to both of these effects, and so I already hear you asking yourself where you might actually employ this. They're actually more useful than you might think. You can employ these at Telos both for him and for all of his golems. They're amazingly effective DPS strategies against all of the pets at Beastmaster as well as the jellyfish that are spawned during Yakimaru, and most of the time they're your best DPS strategy against any of the higher level Slayer mobs that have a decent chunk of HP. We're going to cover a rotation for each style, but if you're only looking for one in particular, as usual check the video description for timestamps. Let's start by taking a look at ranged, since this is the easiest of the three rotations to execute. For the sake of making it easier to understand how this rotation is going to actually work, I've split all of the abilities that we would commonly use as part of our DPS rotation into two categories. The abilities that we're calling Category A are just any abilities that are fired in a standard global cooldown and last a total of 3 game ticks. Category B abilities are channeled abilities that last any time longer than that. The reason this distinction is important is if we were to take one of these longer channeled abilities and put it earlier in the rotation, the bind effect is going to wear off before we get our third opportunity to use Piercing Shot. This results in it dealing half as much damage, and in general, the rotation is going to be significantly weaker as a result. With all that said, this rotation is actually very simple. We'll start off with either Binding Shot or Tight Bindings, the basic and threshold stuns for ranged respectively, and the bind duration on these is long enough for us to get 3 piercing shots as long as we're only using a standard global cooldown ability between those. After that third piercing shot is our opportunity to use one of those channeled abilities, since they do deal significant damage and we wouldn't want to completely leave them out of the rotation. Furthermore, what makes this especially strong is that if we were to, for example, completely go through this rotation while using the basic stun, we can then use the threshold stun and go through it a second time, and once we've finished that second rotation, our basic stun is off cooldown again, and so we can loop this indefinitely. Here's just one example of how you could fill that ability rotation in with basics. This would yield a total of 56% adrenaline, but it's also extremely high DPS. You have to remember that because of the fact that each of these piercing shots is dealing double damage, they're hitting as much as an ability like Dragon Breath would. We could also fill in the rotation with threshold abilities like so, or we could put Death Swiftness in there somewhere to increase our overall outgoing damage with its passive effect. There's really no limit to how much we can customize and improvise with this ability framework, and so it gives us a wonderful baseline to work from anytime we're dealing with an enemy that can be stunned or bound. Now let's start taking a look at magic, where the rotation is almost identical, however it's quite a bit more difficult to execute this. The stun abilities with magic lack that really long duration bind that the ranged ones have, and so the best combination that we could do strictly with ability effects is to sneak in one rack after using the threshold stun. Obviously that's pretty underwhelming, so instead we're going to be exploiting the bind effect that's been added to the ice spells from the Ancient Magic spellbook. The only important thing to keep in mind in that regard is that the duration of the bind is different for each tier of ice spells, so for this example I'll be using Ice Barrage. If you don't have access to that yet and you're using a weaker variant with a shorter time span, you'll have to cut down on the rotation to compensate. Finally, we run into the issue of actually applying this bind. If we use an auto attack, the rate of applying the bind is 100%, however with abilities it's only 10% or 20% when using the Dark Form Prayer. This makes this rotation very easy to do when we're first engaging combat, since we're always going to start with an auto attack, or anytime we use a defensive ability or our damage boosting ultimate ability, since we're going to slip an auto attack in there as well. It's often difficult, however, to determine when this effect is being applied by an ability, but there are a few ways we can do that. The first is that visual effect that you see of things swirling around the wolf, but this can be extremely difficult to see on larger enemies. The second is the little coiled rope icon on the debuff bar that indicates the target is bound. However, the debuff bar often takes a few seconds to refresh, so this is one of the slower ways of determining that the bind has been applied. The last is that if you have an enemy that's incentivized to enter melee distance with you and they randomly stop as you're moving around, you can be relatively sure you've bound them. This is by far the hardest part of using this rotation with magic, however the more you practice with it, the more intuitively you'll recognize when an enemy has been bound, and the more you'll be able to employ this effectively. With the difficulties of working around all that aside, the rotation itself is quite simple and is totally identical to ranged. We'll just be using rack followed by a non-channeled ability, rack and another non-channeled ability, and then rack and finally one of our channeled abilities. Before we close out with magic, I should add that if we're in any kind of a team encounter, say for example we're at Beastmaster and we have a team of 10 who are currently attacking the pets, any one player's bind is going to apply to everyone, so we can simply ignore all of the difficulty of applying a bind ourselves with the Ice Barrage auto attacks or paying attention to when it's being applied with abilities, and simply piggyback on the fact that we have rangers on our team who will be using the basic and threshold stuns for stun rotations of their own. The same would go for Jellyfish at Yakimaru or plenty of other circumstances. Finally, that brings us to melee, which is definitely the runt of the litter when it comes to stun rotations. In one respect, melee can be advantageous here because there are two abilities that deal double damage against stunned or bound enemies, that being Slice and Punish. Each of them also only has a 3-second cooldown, which means you can use Slice and Punish and Slice and Punish and Slice and Punish for as long as you'd like. This works great when we're piggybacking on binds being applied by someone else like we were just talking about with magic. However, unfortunately, melee doesn't really have any ability to apply long-term binds itself. The threshold stuns do last just long enough to get one ability in afterward, however they deal so little damage compared to the other melee thresholds that even the combination of the two together is likely not going to be worthwhile to use as part of a normal DPS rotation. That being said, melee does have one nice combo that you'll use constantly when you're doing Slayer and also has some PvP applications. This comes from the ability Barge, which you should be using when you're doing Slayer anyway as a means of moving to a new target after you've killed your previous one. But this ability also applies a 6.6 second bind, which is just long enough for you to use Slice and Punish and Slice again. That bind will increase the average damage of each of those abilities up to on par with your strongest melee basics like Cleave and Sever. The only downside is that the cooldown on Barge is 20 seconds, so you can only use this about 3 times per minute. Even still, using this you should notice a pretty significant increase in your overall kills per hour while you're doing Slayer. Thanks as usual for watching, guys. If you've got any questions about the video, drop them in the comment section below and I'll do what I can to answer them. Don't forget to rate it, comment, subscribe, sub to the channel, all that usual YouTube crap. You can also follow me on Twitter at the Junesong RS, or if you're feeling like an absolute legend, you can click on the donate link and help support this channel through Patreon. Thanks again for watching, and I'll see you guys in the next video.